Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for U Sports Football. Me and Tom are back on the mics, live and direct in the same room for quite a while, bringing you our conference preview of the 2026 CanWest season. We're going to dive into any of the changes that have taken place in the rosters going into this year, who we expect to be in that Hardy Cup, potentially who we expect to be raising that Hardy Cup, and so much more. But first, Tom, how the heck are you doing, my friend?
I could not be doing any better. I'm finally doing a podcast with my man in person here. How could I not be on cloud nine? We're talking about one of the best conferences that we have in U Sports in the CanWest. And for the folks who are watching us on YouTube, this is a little bit of a preview here. We're testing things out because we might have an upgraded version of how to bring you game day lives going out for the rest of the year. So let us know what you think.
We're very excited about the potential that this gives for us to be able to do more of those live broadcasts. But as we mentioned, today is all about the CanWest. And similarly, Tom, as we talked about with the RCQ, I want to kind of throw a couple sort of big questions your way. Sort of to start the conversation, we can kind of get into the nitty-gritty from there, okay? Number one, past 2 years, we've seen the Hardy Cup run through Saskatchewan. Not specifically the Huskies themselves, because obviously 2 years past, it was the Rams raising the Hardy Cup. Last year, it was, of course, Saskatchewan. But through the Battle of Saskatchewan, does that still reign supreme in the CanWest Conference for this year? Second question I want to throw your way to be able to pick up on is, as far as the marketability of CanWest, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I think that if you're the folks trying to build the conference, or sorry, it's already a built conference, continue to help it grow, you got to look at that battle between Drew Viato, David Jordan on these two up-and-coming teams with UBC and Calgary. And of course, when we talk CanWest, say up-and-coming, but at the end of the day, you know, again, UBC's in a Vanier Cup 3 years ago, right? But there's just that amount of turnover, smaller conference, all these types of things. Really excited to talk about those two clubs. I want to talk about the quarterback room for Coach Bones' Alberta Golden Bears. And then lastly, with a couple of the leaving parts out of the Manitoba Bisons, has their window to be in a Hardy Cup, let alone to compete to get into a national semifinal, closed. So the Hardy Cup running through Saskatchewan, the ascension of UBC and Calgary with those dynamic quarterbacks, Alberta with that interesting quarterback room, or the the Manitoba Bisons perhaps having to retool for this year and hopefully not too much longer. Where do you want to start the conversation?
Well, let's start the conversation with what I think is probably the easiest answer here. And the answer is, does the Hardy Cup still run through Saskatchewan? And the answer is just outright yes. Okay. With all of the amazing players that they have coming back on both sides, with the mere fact that this year we are so excited to announce that Anton Ammonroot is back for the Saskatchewan Huskies. He is on the full mend with everything that he has been going through. And we have to say again, Anton, we are massive fans of you. We are so happy that you are doing well, and we only wish the very best for you. But with that young man, his performance last year for the Huskies when he was playing, that Saskatchewan took the leap and made it to the fact that they were Hardy Cup champions yet again. So I think the Saskatchewan is right there. I think Regina is only going to get better, especially in the playoff run with Marshall Erickson being out in that unbelievable run game. So yes, I think of everything that's in here in the CanWest, and it's certainly the most volatile of the conferences in terms of anybody can win at any time. But yes, Saskatchewan is still where the Hardy Cup will be this year.
Okay, well then let's dive into these two clubs, because I think it's fascinating to look at the way that the sort of shape and identity of the clubs has maybe changed from when we saw them battle out a couple years ago, even last year a little bit. Because yes, as you mentioned, Anton Ammonroot back. This has been something that's been widely discussed for the last number of months. It's so amazing, and you'll have to remind me through how many games, but was it 4 games he played in last year before unfortunately having to leave the program? I mean, 1,600 yards, 14 touchdowns, no interceptions in half a season's of work is ridiculous. But as we talked about when we did the Saskatchewan podcast on the exit meetings, you're losing so many tools around him, right? Obviously, we know Daniel Weeb's gone, Riker Frank's gone, Varva's gone. Like, those are not just tools, those are absolute weapons that any team would be longing for. And on the other hand, though, even though they're losing guys like Charlie Parks on their defense. Why am I forgetting? I'm going through my notes here, of course. We've been talking about Seth Hundaby, your boy, of course, him being gone as well. There's still some major pieces on that defense. This is one of the best defenses in all of U Sports. Last year, I won't go into too much of the detail of just taking over the whole conversation, but still a defense that is ripe with talent. So on the one hand, you have perhaps one of the most talented quarterbacks in all of U Sports. He's back. Where are the weapons? A defense that's losing some major guys as well, but I think the depth is a little more at time of recording here, and like teams are reporting training camp today. This pod will be coming out camps will be happening. So unfortunately, there may be some like cold takes exposed, I suppose, as like things get revealed in camp. But you have a bit more reliability on the returning guys on defense, even with some of those big guys heading out. Whereas on the flip side, I think this Regina offense, now a team that gave Laval all they could handle and more on the back of that defense being supremely talented, and they still return a lot of those big names. Carson Sombach being perhaps as prominent as any on that defensive end. Brandon Wong, and a guy we really like as well there. Where that offense now, with what we saw from Sieben last year, really taking control of that offense, and obviously, as you allude to, Marshall Erickson, if he's healthy, perhaps the prohibitive favorite for a CanWest MVP in the mix, it almost feels like the defense we know is good. But if you compare their offenses, just because when you compare returning players, you almost, again, Anton being back is amazing. Him at his best is perhaps as good we have going in Canada right now as a quarterback. But from the things we know of the programs, you might almost give the nod to Regina offensively, just having a bit more reliability with the guys that are returning. I didn't even mention Nicholas Sirleaf's name there as well.
100%. And when you look at some of the amazing targets and the amazing people that they have on Regina, Sirleaf, Erickson, even Christian Contende as well, a phenomenal running back who obviously took over when Marshall Erickson was injured. Yes, Regina is absolutely a team to watch out for, and they could be the clear favorites going into this year, but I would not sleep on Saskatchewan. Let's not forget Daniel Kabongo, also on this Saskatchewan receiver team. Dawson Linnea was also a part of this team as well. There's a number of guys in here, even Liam Pichinen, who were targets. And I think, if nothing else, it really showcases that when Anton Ammonrud was out there for the Saskatchewan team, it was similar to how you described McMaster back in the day, because we were just talking about this, where it was Anton and friends. He's getting the ball to everybody on the field because it doesn't matter who's open. He's getting them the ball because he's got that trust. When you have the other young man and Jake Farrell come in, now suddenly it's the Rhett Varva show. It's the Daniel Weeb show.
Not the Rhett Varva show.
Not the Rhett Varva show, unfortunately. But yes, you understand what I'm saying, where you're leaning on some of those more senior guys there to really step up and to take over in cases where you need them to. Now, probably the most significant loss, I would say certainly for Saskatchewan, but potentially across. And Saskatchewan's losing Seth Hundaby.
Yeah.
But the most significant, got to be Riker Frank. Riker Frank not being on this offense anymore certainly could change what happens here, because he was so versatile and able to run the ball. And we said this before, Saskatchewan runs arguably the greatest zone run scheme that anybody says, and that's verified by G. Marsh, who is the king of running the football, so that's something. But to have Riker Frank being gone certainly adds into this. I'm not saying that they don't have great running backs, because of course they do. Coach Flory and the rest of that team do a great job recruiting, but you are going to have some stalwarts who are going to be leaving, which is why all the more important you lean on Anton and you lean on that passing game to really set things up for you.
For starters, because you might not have caught it. I started to giggle when you talked about us talking about McMaster from years bygone. Tom and I spent a good portion of our morning together, literally just going through rosters of 2019 OUA teams and just kind of marveling at some of the talent around there. So that's what we do, even when we're not on the pod. We're doing a U Sports pod to begin with. I want to pick up on the Riker Frank piece, specifically what you said about the zone offense that Coach Flory runs as prominently as any other. And of course, even if this is a team that's, like, I think even with Anton in last year at the start of the season and years past, with how amazing Frank has been in that run game, it was a balanced offensive attack, and especially with Mason Nias as the offensive coordinator, of course, Saskatchewan legend in that passing game and everything like that. I think it's perhaps fair to say that, like, if only to start the season, you allude to this. Maybe they rely on the passing attack to kind of allow them to excel, stay in games, win games, and then you help develop that running game. And we talked about a bit of this on the exit meeting about Sask, where the nice thing when you have a certain institutional knowledge of how to run the ball, how to run zone offense, and again, this is a Sask team that's bringing back Jack Warwick after a bit of time at the CFL level, where as long as you have good folks coaching up those running backs in terms of shoulders and hips square, maintaining vision, the patience to the line of scrimmage, pressing that point of attack, but allowing your double teams to develop and finding that gap from front side C or D all the way back to, however far their landmark is going to take them. it's a system in which, as long, and there's no reason to believe whomever, whether it's Caden Miller, who we saw get a few touches, but again, it's hard to project because it truly was the Riker Frank show. The number of touches he got, and again, that includes out of the backfield, working into the passing game, is remarkable. So again, it's not just a loss in the run game, it's in the passing attack as well. But I think that's important to highlight, as we were saying, of like, when you are heralded by, again, someone as goated as Greg Marshall, that you run zone better than anyone, it perhaps allows slightly easier for the plug and play. The same way that, like, with Western, when they run their power G offense, are there nuances to running like that more downhill gap scheme offense that there are to running into zone offense? Sure. But when you can just rely on saying that, like, we are going to teach you how to be a good gap runner, we're going to teach you how to be a good zone runner, that can make up for not having the natural talent of Riker Frank. So the ceiling might come down of like great zone team, and then Riker Frank makes you one of the most deadly attacks. But that O-line and their ability, Tommy's excited, I'm excited, we're talking a little O-line, that sets a floor that's pretty high, and when it's complemented by a passing attack, you know, again, you're certainly right to answer the question of does the Hardy Cup run through Saskatchewan? I certainly agree, and the answer is yes. And I don't want to pivot off of talking about these two clubs just yet, because there's so much more to dive into it. But one of the questions I'm going to come back to is that, like, I agree the Hardy Cup will run through the province of Saskatchewan, but whether we get a Battle of Saskatchewan for the Hardy Cup again this year, to me that's still in the air, because especially once we start talking about UBC and Calgary, and golly, I mean, if you've been following the pod for a few years, you know it's not necessarily an easy pill for me to swallow that I'm actually so in on these Calgary Dinos. But I'm so in on these Calgary Dinos, and I'm so in on UBC and Drew Viato and what they're building there. But again, I don't want to get there quite yet, because I want to keep talking about these guys, these two clubs, and I want to stay with Saskatchewan to talk about their defense, because as much as we talked about, as much as we brought up Charlie Parks, again, stalwart defensive lineman, the best lineman in all of Canada last year, and of course the best defensive player in all of Canada in your boy, your guy, as we're now starting to incorporate, in Seth Hundaby leaving. As I just look down, and our guy, Inesu Latmore, being out there as well, John Stahl moving on as well. We're looking at a D-line, and again, we talked about these things on the Sask pod that still touts the names of Reese Cack and Reese McCormick, just to look at two who, as we joked about, were mixing it up at East-West in those trenches sometimes, throwing hands, not just in, the way the D-linemen typically do. We look at a linebacking core that with Seth Hundaby out, I'm so excited to see this now truly become, not just from a linebacker perspective, but maybe across the board, Jacob Goldstone's defense. He led them in tackles last year. The guy rocks 55. I'm going to have love for him. And if it's not his team or his defense to speak of, I think the next team you have to talk about is it Ethan Lang's defense at that safety position, kind of patrolling in the back end. At the end of it, it's all these pieces that make it what it is. Throw in a guy like Lucas Shank into the mix as well, Carter Stadnick. It's amazing. And again, this is why we've become so enthralled with CanWest football, where a team like this can lose some of these names we've talked about, and we're still here saying that they might be the favorite coming out of CanWest, but they're certainly a favorite to be in that game again. Tom, when you think about those names they still have on defense, especially with in light of those major losses. And we're talking Metris and President's Trophy winners. It's unbelievable how they're perhaps not even going to skip a beat defensively as one of the best defenses that was in all of Canada last year.
Well, certainly, especially when you watch the East-West Bowl and you saw some of the most prominent names on there were from the Huskies. You saw both of the Reeses there mixing it up, doing their thing. You saw Ethan Lang be one of the most prominent defenders that's there.
Defensive player of the game.
And that's not to mention the fact that Jacob Goldstone, like you mentioned, led them in tackles, and now it was in his second year, now entering into his third year, which is wild to think about.
Goldie, come on.
So he's going to make a major step up in this, and I'm really confident that this team is going to be right back in there. And that they are losing some guys, including an OUA guy of ours, an Inesu Latmore. He came back for the victory lap with Saskatchewan, obviously made it to a Vanier Cup, so congratulations to him. But I'm very, very confident that this team is going to be solid throughout, because we've seen so many of the names that are here, and they've really done their thing. Where I wanted to take things a little bit is to this Regina team.
Yeah, let's do it.
Especially when you look at all of the guys that are going to be moving on. Nick Bukowski, Logan Huberick, Riley Schick from that offensive line. Those are major names. Gavin Whittingham from the running back room. Trey Jones, Emmett Stedman, Ryland Skokel, and Joe Kaplan from the receiving core. That's a massive front. There's a lot of guys that are leaving from this team that were very, very key to this team, including Chopper Hippe from the linebacking core. There's a number of guys within this Regina team that are moving on. Now, obviously, I have the exact same level of respect for the Regina Rams that I do for the Saskatchewan Huskies. I have no doubt that they're going to be retooling and re-upping, especially with a guy like Carson Sombach being back, like you mentioned. The Sombachs in Regina are just, they're royalty at this point. And every single Sombach seems to come through this place no matter what. But I think there's a lot of guys to have to replace, especially the fact of how many guys they're going to have to replace on that offensive line. Makes me a little nervous. Now, you got a great running back like Christian Contende and especially Marshall Erickson, but how good can you be when you don't have the line in front of you? All of those things come into play, so that's why I have a little bit of apprehension around the Regina Rams.
You know, it's an interesting question because in some ways it's perhaps the inverse of Saskatchewan, specifically from the run game, where because of those losses, and like we're talking about, like as far as guys that are coming back, Ethan Graham coming back from spending some time at the CFL level, so you love that. Where the inverse being the fact that when you just look at backfield talent, again, I don't think there's a player in CanWest and, you know, like without trying to think about too much, maybe across Canada, that's going to be as dynamic a running back as Marshall Erickson is. But as you allude to, with those losses, even with Graham coming back, he might not have the Hoggies in front of him to open up, where on the flip side with Sass, they're bringing a lot of those boys up front. They move Riker Frank on, but there's that institutional piece there. So that'll be an interesting case study to kind of see which wins out, having the surefire absolute beast in the backfield with perhaps some guys that were backing up a bit more, filling in on the offensive line, versus a situation where the O-line stays consistent, you're getting a new running back. And so I think that's going to be fascinating to watch. And yes, Christian Contende does deserve some love as well because he's a veteran presence back there who's been able to spell Erickson phenomenally. Let me ask this super quickly as well, sticking with the offense. Are we sure like it's Owen Seaban's team, or is there a possibility as we like see how things go out through camp, Noah Pelletier is still in the mix? And we're about to talk about quarterback rooms in a little bit, specifically when we get to Alberta, where, I disappeared from Zoom there, where we don't always love it if teams don't have that figured out. And it seems like these guys did figure it out last year, so maybe I'm just, making something out of nothing. But what's your confidence meter that from what we saw out of Seaban, which was pretty dang good last year, that he's won over Pelletier, who for most of his career was a guy that he was competing with when you think about the quarterback room there for Regina? Where does your mind go to?
Well, honestly, the biggest aspect to me is that the fact that Coach McConkey made that switch between Pelletier and Owen Seaban when they were 6-0 at the time, maybe 5-1. This was not something that they came by lightly, and was constantly something that they are evaluating. So I don't think, regardless of what happens here, that it's just going to be, okay, this is our guy, we're just going to set it and forget it, and then that's it. I think they're constantly going to be evaluating, but especially when you look at the numbers from last year. Noah Pelletier, 63.5% completion rating, 1,344 yards, 8 touchdowns to 1 interception, versus Owen Seaban, 73.5% on his completion rating, 657 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Now, you look at those numbers, you say, well, of course, Noah Pelletier should be the guy, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at the way the two of them operated, when you look at the way that the offense was evolving with Seaban versus with Pelletier in both settings, this is where it comes into play because, again, as a quarterback, there's arguably no one position that affects an offense more than who you have slinging the rock. So changing the team and changing the dynamic, especially when you have a guy like Marshall Erickson goes down, now suddenly you have to have a certain dynamic change. Christian Contende obviously was that guy for them and really was able to do his thing. But is Noah Pelletier a guy that you can confidently rely on to win you a game? Is Owen Seaban the guy that you can rely on to win you a game? And like we mentioned previously on other podcasts, if there's ever a battle between two guys in one position, the favor goes to the younger guy because you've got more time with him. And that's certainly the case with Owen Seaban in this case. I'm not saying that that's why Coach McConkey and the rest of the Regina Rams staff made that choice, but there's certainly going to be a battle throughout training camp to see who is the guy here because both of them have showcased why they deserve a chance at the QB1 spot.
And for what it's worth, too, I think we brought this up in talking with Coach McConkey. And again, like if you didn't get a chance to listen to that Regina exit meeting, I mean, if you didn't get a chance to listen to any of the exit meetings, like what are you doing with your life? Go listen to those, but especially the ones where we had coaches on. And in talking to Coach McConkey, it's so cool of him being, talking about people who understand passing attacks out of Regina. Like he is part of that history for them. And so beyond just his knowledge as a head coach, as an offensive coach, as a receivers coach, all those types of things, it's like he's been in that he's worn that green. He's been in those games. He's been in that stadium, and so I kind of have that extra trust in him making that decisions. Beyond the fact that I don't usually like have question these coaches. There's a reason they're in the positions that they are, and the reason I'm in the position that I'm in. Let's then pivot. Talk just like a little bit more about the defense before we move on to sort of the next kind of category of questions we want to talk about with CanWest, because I know like to sort of jump ahead to the OUA pod for next week. Like in the past, for folks listening, like as you know, we've done the tier pods for the OUA since we've expanded to all conferences. We're kind of keeping it to one pod per conference on the preview. But as you'll get on the OUA pod, the kind of ambition we have, as we've kind of wanted to set out, is that like in talking about the big questions in the OUA, is that it'll kind of naturally help us talk about teams in terms of tiers of where they sit and whose neighborhood they're in. And I kind of think this is happening naturally with this pod as well, where it's still, as we've both kind of come in agreement, CanWest runs through the province of Saskatchewan. They're kind of in that tier of their own, not to say that like they might not lose a game here or there to some of those other teams. So to finish off the conversation of this proverbial tier 1 of CanWest football here, aka the Battle of Saskatchewan, we talked about Carson Sombach being back. But the thing I want to talk about in specific, especially as we discussed with Saskatchewan being still, like with Anton being the idea that like as they figure out who fills in for Riker Frank, they have arguably the best quarterback in Canada, that even with losing a guy like Daniel Weeb and Varva, theoretically, if he's healthy and he's playing, that you still trust that it's going to be the passing game for Sask that allows the run game to get settled in a bit more. Again, obviously with that O-line being back, you feel good about that. But we mentioned Carson Sombach's name. I want to also mention the name of, I think, if my recollection is, if I recall correctly, my guy and Brandon Wong.
Yes, sir.
Mentioned the name of guys like Jacob Tkachuk and Max Polischuk, and as well as a young Ryler Sombach, who is no doubt, again, if he's assuming, and a Connor Sombach as well in that defensive backfield. So like just entrusting that even if they haven't made their impact yet, that just literally buying into the name itself. And I say all that, and if you're not following along at home, I'm listing off essentially the core defensive backfield for these Regina Rams, which is again what kept them in that game against Laval. And if there's one thing we learned about Laval with Arnaud Desjardins' time, is that like the reason that game probably was so low scoring is because he knew that those deep shots weren't going to be there against this team, and having to try to death by 1,000 cuts, and they ended up prevailing in that one. And so ultimately what I want to pose to you, and they do bring back a young guy in Liam LaBelle, who was actually their sack leader last year in the linebacking core. I'm not as familiar with their frontline guys, but it's an interesting matchup, the same way that we juxtapose the fact that Regina has the go-to running back, and frankly running backs, we add in Contenders as well, but they move off a lot of the O-line, where Sask has the O-line back. The running back is the question itself, where it's fun to also now juxtapose that Anton Emerud's back. He's got to figure out maybe some of those receivers. Obviously, you mentioned a couple of those names in specific, obviously with our guy, again, another OUA guy in Daniel Kabongo, and rightfully so mentioned Dawson Linnea. But with perhaps as strong a defensive core as there is in U Sports, that's an interesting matchup to think about if they have sort of the thing to stifle what Sask might have better than anyone else.
Yeah, certainly when you look at this Regina team, there's a lot of things to be excited about, especially on the defense. Again, having 3 Sombach brothers on the team at the same time is incredible. But a number of guys on that defense that have obviously been able to step up and really do their thing. I mean, there's a reason why they were in so tight with the Laval Rouge et Or a couple years ago. It was because of that defense, and they arguably won the game against Saskatchewan in that Hardy Cup because of that defense as well. So no doubt that Regina will continue that strong showing. It obviously might change some of the players that are in there. Brandon Wong will be a little bit more prominent. Jacob Tkachuk will be in there a little bit more. But again, total confidence in this team, and it is very interesting to look at a team where a Saskatchewan Husky team going up against a Regina Ram team, whether that's in the Hardy Cup or just in the regular season. Certainly when you look at the offensive showcase in terms of Anton Ammonrud and everybody else, they might be playing into Regina's best aspects of their defense in that back end. But again, this is a team where, yes, Saskatchewan's going to be having to replace Riker Frank for sure. That's going to be a big loss. But they still run zone better than anybody. So if that front line for Regina is not ready to go, and I'm not saying that they won't be, but if they're not, this could be a long game where Saskatchewan runs all over them. Now, again, that secondary for them, that linebacking core for Regina is incredible, but we're going to have to see some big ups from that Regina Rams defensive line.
Okay. Well, I love it, and I think we've done justice for the province of Saskatchewan in the conversation. But again, this is our CanWest pod, so if that's our tier 1 of, call it the Hardy Cup tier, I want to then call this next tier the potential contenders, not to be confused with the Christian contenders. In UBC and Calgary. Again, the parallel that's most obvious is you look at the two quarterbacks in David Jordan for Calgary coming from, was it Florida A&M, if I remember correctly, where he was coming from in the States. Not terribly important. But a guy in David Jordan coming from his time in the States 2 years past, Drew Viotto similarly coming from a bit of time in the NCAA. We've seen a track record of guys have that same route, obviously in the OUA just recently with Cal Wither, and then being the most prominent quarterback in all of Canada last year, sticking within CanWest with Blake Nils, UBC Thunderbirds, with, you're going to help bail me out on this one because I'm forgetting O'Connor, Michael O'Connor, right? Yep. We've seen this happen before. We saw them have prominent years last year. Where do you want to start with between these two teams? Thinking about, again, to me, to simplify it to its core, is two of the most exciting up-and-coming quarterbacks that we have, not just in CanWest, but in all of U Sports.
Certainly. And when you start looking at this Calgary Dino team, the first thing that kind of struck our eye going into last year was the makeup of it. A number of fourth and fifth year guys, a number of first year guys, and nothing really in the middle here. They had to really rely on a lot of those first year players when coming into Calgary. And obviously, anytime you have to rely on a number of first year players, that can provide a number of issues there. People aren't used to the speed of the game. They're not used to whatever the case may be. But this was a Dino squad that, despite going 3-5, was very close to going, 6-2?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
With the overtime loss to Regina in week 1, with the tight games against everybody else seemingly in the entire conference here, is enough to pull out a lot of those coaches and fans' hair, saying, we were this close to being at the very top of the CanWest versus we finished near the bottom of the CanWest. So I think that this is really interesting to look at. Now, obviously, with that makeup of that team is the amount of guys that they're going to be losing from this team, those fourth and fifth year guys who are moving on and have to be replaced by those first year players. You already mentioned that the quarterbacks are very, very interesting. Obviously, David Jordan being the premier guy for them, but losing guys like Chris Pashula, Braden Sesman, Daniel Stefanek from that offensive line is massive. Matt Stibley, Mikhail Anish, Desjardins also leaving from this squad. And, of course, on that defense as well, where arguably the Dinos were most dominant. That's really where my concern comes into play. I think that from a growth standpoint, every team obviously gets better from their years going on for sure. But losing some of those key guys could really hurt the Dinos going into this year.
That's totally fair. I think I had my notes wrong, because I think going into this, I thought Matt Sibley was back, so that's obviously a massive loss for them there. The thing that, because when we talk about UBC, if we're going to, again, talk about losses as far as the weapons around the quarterback, Shamar McBean, number 1, and then Edrin Williams-Hernandez, those are major losses for him in terms of weapons. But if we're just sticking in terms of, just the losses, I then look to the fact that the combination of not just Matthew Clark, who we were really big on going into East-West last year, but Evan Smith as that H-back for them, who, as we've talked about, having a great H-back, similar to having a great Sam linebacker defensively, just unlocks so much because of how that position can connect your pass to your defense offensively, or your passing defense to your run defense on the other side of the ball. And Evan Smith, as I disappear from the Zoom there for a second, Evan Smith was, I believe, first-team All-Canadian at the position. So I'm excited for that from the standpoint that, yes, you're right, Sibley being gone, huge. That O-line, those are big question marks to fill in from there. But with Matthew Clark and Evan Smith, and we saw, they use Smith in a lot of those, whether you call it zone slice or whatever those looks are, where that H-back comes across to cap the backside end instead of reading him, and then all of a sudden you're getting him out into the flats, much like we talked about Riker Frank. Is the guy in Smith who they're comfortable throwing the ball out to when the moment's right. So from that standpoint, I feel good about it. But the name that we haven't mentioned for the Calgary Dinos when we talk about them, or forgive me if you did, is the fact that Matt Sibley being gone, totally fair. These guys in the O-line you mentioned about, a couple of these guys going to the league, totally fair. I love Matthew Clark. I love Evan Smith. But the combination of David Jordan and Zion Grant might be the best 1-2 punch quarterback, QB, and wide receiver one there is in youth sports right now, because dang, Zion Grant's coming off of one of the best rookie seasons that we had last year, and if we deep dived it, probably in a while from a receiver position, and the thought of them only getting to build that connectivity that much more, being able to use that run game with Clark, like we talked about it, where this is a team that like lived and died through their pass game last year, and theoretically that pass game might just get better with Jordan's evolution as a passer in the Canadian game, and with Zion going into his second year. But as a whole offense, with a guy like Clark, I think they could have still a well-rounded offense. But even if you're just going to say we're going to throw the ball 40 times a game as an offense, I like that as a matchup you can have there.
100%. When you start looking at the production, like you were mentioning, there is little to say about how on the same page David Jordan and Zion Grant were. Now, obviously, when you start looking around and saying, okay, well, if we lock down Zion Grant, then theoretically we should be able to stop this team, especially with an offensive line that's graduating so many players. Who knows how effective Matthew Clark will be? I have total confidence that Matthew Clark will still be a guy for them that you have to look at and you have to make sure that you are accounting for. I think David Jordan will grow as a quarterback as well. And while I still think that Zion Grant is going to be his favorite target, I think finding a couple other guys in that great receiving core as well will only add to how good this team can really be. But again, like I mentioned, a lot of dudes leaving from this side, a lot of fourth and fifth year guys who were stalwarts on that Calgary Dinos team. So we'll see how well that offense can truly be.
Well, given that David Jordan, I think, is 6'5", I don't know if there's room to grow from that standpoint, but point taken. I want to switch over to UBC a little bit more, just to, again, talk about that offense. And I kind of brought it up in sort of as a comparison. If we're going to talk about losses as far as weapons are concerned, yes, your point's well made with Calgary and talking about Shamar McBean, Edrin Williams-Hernandez. Those are major names as well. As far as the running back field, I don't think it's as heralded as Matthew Clark is for Calgary. But you look at Tola Ayadegbe, you look at Riley Michaud. These are two guys that perhaps as a unit can compare to what one Clark can do for Calgary. Bit more continuity on the O-line. So when you look at the weapons around Viato, and of course it's worth noting that unlike Jordan last year, who aside from short yardage situations where they put in Jet Zichevsky, I think I got his name right in there, for short yardage situations, there's games where UBC was still going back to Derek Angle. Mm-hmm. Angle's gone. Like I don't see a, pardon the pun, an angle in which this is anything but Viato's team to run, and that confidence that then comes from, as we've talked about this with other clubs. I think we talked about this with Pepe, of like another guy who earned his spot a couple weeks into the season, and then beyond the fact that he then got the reps thereon, but then a full off season of like, yeah, you're QB1, I think is massive. So I do think the growth from Viato will be momentous as a result of Angle having graduated out. And I do like, the kind of 1-2 punch of Ayadegbe and Michaud, though I think Clark is better than maybe either one of them individually, the continuity of the O-line. And I know Trey Montour is the name that we'll probably talk about. How do you feel of the collection of talent that Viato has around him in addition to his own growth now that he is just the guy for them?
I really feel confident that Drew Viato will take a massive step forward in this UBC offense. I think that he's only going to get more and more accustomed to the Canadian game, and how much you want to say about last year with him experiencing that. Let's not forget, he was down in the U.S. for his high school season, and then he spent a number of years, at least 1 year, down at the university level in that. So he had a good chunk of time where he's doing 4 down, he's focusing on the American size field, and now comes back up to Canada with our superior field size and everything else. But
bigger balls.
I think he's only going to get better and better, especially at the fact that their young all-Canadian offensive lineman Caleb Cunningham was just in his second year last year. So he's going to come back again, be a stalwart on that offensive line that's only going to get better and better. And I think that this UBC offense, while in something of a transitionary period, obviously this past year having lost Isaiah Knight, trying to find who their next guy is in that running back space. Derek Engel still in that setting as just somebody who is solid and that you can rely on. Now this is Drew Viotto. You've seen what Engel can do. You've learned from your own mistakes. Take over this team offensively, and let's see what the Thunderbirds can really do, especially when you're hucking bombs down to Trey Montour down the seam.
Let's switch over to the defense a little bit. And on the one hand, though I had the Matt Sibley piece incorrect on thinking he was returning, I'm very certain Calgary is returning Osasere Odewinge into that linebacking core, who was a menace for them last year. I forget where he ended up getting drafted to, but he's back. Mm-hmm. And then, again, without oversimplifying it, speaking about a loss that we know is not coming back, let's pour one out for our guy, Kinsale Phillip. Oh. Well, we've only got coffee here. We're not going to pour that out on these floors right now, but like metaphorically, we're going to pour one out for our guy, Kinsale. Legendary career that young man had. And not to simplify and overlook the talent that's still on that UBC defense and the other weapons that are still on that Calgary defense, to be sure of. But, I mean, we're talking about, I think Kinsale was their leading tackler, and I believe, if I look at it, if he wasn't number one, I think Odewinge was maybe their second top tackler. So the fact that one of them's losing one of their premier guys and the other one's bringing them back after a bit of time in the CFL, without taking into account the other names, just thinking of those two major pieces in the linebacking core for these two teams, that's huge from the Dinos' perspective, and then those are some big shoes to fill from the Thunderbirds' perspective.
Yeah, I think that especially when you looked at this Calgary Dinos team from last year, with all the new faces like Zion Grant, David Jordan, everybody else going into this season, you had to rely on a stalwart defense that the Dinos were going to produce here, and getting Odewinge back is incredible for this team, and especially when you look at the rest of that defensive line. They're only really losing Liam Reed from up front. Everybody else in there, I think Sylvester Ibello is going to have another massive year for them. I think he's going to do some great things on that defensive line as well. Losing a number of guys in the defensive secondary does hurt for you as for the Calgary Dinos, but I still think that with Odemwembe back, and the rest of that defense having such depth on there, I still think that they're going to be a defense to watch out for. Now, when you go to UBC, obviously Kinsale moving on hurts not just the Thunderbirds, but us as well, because he's our guy, and getting a chance to see his transition from quarterback at U of T to linebacker extraordinaire at UBC was truly incredible. But what he brought to the table was just a side-to-side, sideline-to-sideline tackling machine, where he was in on damn near every tackle that UBC had here. So you're going to need some of your other guys to step up in his place to really combat that. Now, I think that they've got a number of guys in here that I think will come back into this. Reese Griffiths was a guy on the linebacking core that we saw pretty consistently here that I think will step up to replace in certain spaces. But UBC is certainly going to have to change who their primary tackler will be, since he will be moving on.
And that's still a linebacking core that moves on Ben Sangwa and Chase Hennig to the show. So, again, that's a linebacking core that is going to look a lot different, even though, as you allude to, there's still some guys there that we saw get a bit of run for them as well. Either way, to me, those are the two, I guess to pause right there on what we've talked about, I feel pretty confident that that's what we're looking at for the playoff picture out of CanWest. The two Sask teams, likely 1 and 2, and then UBC and Calgary coming in next with the potentiality of one of them sneaking into that Hardy Cup. And if it's not this year, then look out for 2027, where it could be the Viotto versus Jordan Hardy Cup happening, which I think would be so stellar and just such great branding for CanWest. With that in mind, we then get down to Regina and Alberta. And I frankly want to start with, Manitoba.
There you go.
For some reason, I struggle with Regina and Manitoba. But we end up with Manitoba and Alberta. And frankly, I hate to put it like this, I want to go with Alberta first and foremost, because they feel like the team that's more on the rise. And Regina is a team that, as we'll talk about, you lose a guy like Tuchinski, you lose a guy like Stubbs. Hey, they've been in the mix for Hardy Cups for the last 5 years with those guys in there. Maybe they'll surprise us, and I'll happily be surprised if they're in the mix as well this year. But we've talked about it. Hey, Alberta team that was in a Hardy Cup a couple of years ago, They're now rebuilding, right? So we see this happen, and we see teams get back to the mountaintop pretty readily. But I want to start with Alberta just because they feel like the younger, up-and-coming team in contrast to, almost did it again, Manitoba. And in specific, much like I prompted you in talking about Laval, I want you to take our folks through a little bit of what's going on with the quarterback room. Because this was already a crowd quarterback room where we saw the battle between Trey and Eli. It's now gone that much more crowded with a pretty heralded name joining them, again, via the U.S. from Quebec originally. Talk about what's going on in that room there.
Christian Veilleux, quarterback coming from a Power 5 conference, joins the Alberta Golden Bears. Somebody who is incredible, is going to push the rest of the quarterbacks within that Alberta Golden Bear room. And I think somebody that is a massive get for Coach Bone and the rest of this coaching staff, because again, we talked about what the influence of getting a really highly talented recruit can do for the rest of your recruiting staff or the recruiting trails. If Christian can come in and really be that guy and showcase an incredible arm talent, or however he wants to showcase his ability under Coach Bone and under that offense, now suddenly you get receivers, you get other people surrounding going, yeah, I want to be a part of the Golden Bears. I want to see what this offensive attack is going to look like here, and certainly brings a lot of really exciting pieces to this Golden Bear team. Now, obviously, we saw Trey Ryder down in East West, and I think it's fair to say, and I think he'd probably agree with you, that of the 4 quarterbacks there, I don't think that he performed very well in everybody else there. But obviously what we saw in his regular season, him and Eli going back and forth in this the rest of the season here. And again, very close games. It wasn't like the Golden Bears were just constantly getting blown out by any means. They were in a lot of the games that were here. So it'll be interesting to see how the 3 of them are acting within that quarterback room and who comes out on top.
I think it's very exciting. And hey, it's hard to be anything but second at best in a quarterback room if one of those guys, is Mr. Tristan Aboud out of the Guelph Griffins. Hey, the kid's pretty good at football. But here's the thing where I think you have to be. You mentioned that point that we talked about in the RCQ podcast of you see the talent there, and that hopefully works as a tool from a recruiting standpoint, because we kind of started the Saskatchewan discussion and like Saskatchewan Huskies discussion around that even though they have undoubtedly the best quarterback there, that the tools around him, and again, they weren't just tools, those were weapons, like
some dudes,
some guys, some just ballers, right? And whether it's Ryder, whether it's Veilleux, the fact they're battling out, and that might not be a decision that's made coming out of camp, they don't get to throw it up to Carter Kettle. Yeah. They don't get to throw it up to Chevy Thomas. They don't get to hand it off to Opio Shinubi. And so it becomes perhaps even that much more of a challenge where, you talk about Trey and you talk about Eli perhaps having the advantage over Veilleux, where they have a bit of a connection with Chevy and with Carter. I mean, that's gone there. And again, I don't know how much maybe that factors into the mix, but either way, Shinubi, Thomas, and most spectacularly, Kettle being gone from this program, or the weapons are massive, especially when you compare it to, again, making the Saskatchewan comparison. None of these guys, I mean, maybe Veilleux gets there, but none of these guys are Anton Ammonroot. And again, it'd be great to see if Coach Bone gets his team to that point. We're certainly not talking about this running infrastructure from their offense of having anything close to what the Huskies do in terms of like you lose a premier back over there, but you just know these guys know how to run zone. So it's both really exciting, but also really terrifying with what this offense is going to do. It kind of feels like high ceiling, but maybe low floor at the same time.
Yeah, I would say from a quarterback battle standpoint, I think that'll actually help the quarterbacks and help Coach Bone in terms of finding his right guy, because you can kind of have a false positive where you're like, yeah, we completed a 60-yard touchdown pass, but it's because you just threw up a prayer over to Carter Kettle. Not to say that I'm saying any one of those quarterbacks is just throwing up a prayer like that, but when you don't have an outstanding receiver like Kettle anymore, now you've got to be, I've got to get my targets right. I got to make sure that I'm putting my guys in the best kind of scenario. I'm not setting them up to be kill shots over the middle, and I'm getting the ball down the field. And whoever is able to really control this offense, I think will really step forward as the premier guy. And I think it'll be easy for the coaching staff to see that. Whether or not they have the same amount of talent in that receiving room is another question. But I think the cream of the crop will rise in that quarterback room because they don't have those guys there, whether that's a positive or negative for the rest of the season.
Totally fair. Much like UBC, flipping over to the defensive side, the loss at linebacker scares me for this team. Chase Tatarin gone. Dayton Ingenhog gone. Chase Pack gone. Those first two names being their leading tacklers from last year. Again, nature abhors a vacuum. Those players leaving means that someone else is going to fill that void. But is the difference between, well, somebody's got to make tackles versus, oh, someone's out there making tackles. And especially looking at Tatarin and Ingenhog, those guys were impact players in that defense and on that linebacking core. That makes me nervous. I don't have too many other notes about this defense other than those guys. But what do you think about that linebacking core? What do you think about the defense that's going to help support this Golden Bears team?
Certainly that linebacking core leaving is something to note. To me, one of the most significant losses here is Emerson Joy from that defensive line. He was only in his second year at 6'6", 240 pounds.
Oh, that's
He was a monster, and his ceiling was through the roof. I thought that he was going to have an incredible career with the Golden Bears, but he's gone down to the NCAA to continue his career.
Atta baby.
So that is a massive loss. Now, they just recently hired on a new defensive coordinator in Robert Payne. He's going to be coming on from the Saskatchewan Huskies here. So he's obviously no slouch when it comes to great teams, championships, and defenses in general here. But this is going to be the single biggest challenge for this Alberta Golden Bears team, is to get this defense back on track. Obviously, they had a lot of struggles last year. Their primary was at 3-4, and especially when you're going up against a team like Saskatchewan that loves to run the ball, that means it's a very difficult time for you to get things going. If a great offensive line can see linebackers coming and blitzing and they're not overwhelmed by the movement, it's tough to be able to stop the run on a 3-4 defense. So seeing where the development from this team comes in, do you become that 4-3 defense? You've got a lot of youth on that defensive line. Do you throw them into the fire? So seeing the growth of this team will very, very assuredly dictate how far they're able to go in this CanWest playoff run.
Last but not least, Manitoba Bisons. Again, it's sometimes oversimplified to look at, a few losses and say that's going to dictate a season. But with this team also being, I'd say, a year already removed from the height of the Jackson Tuchinski era, now that the Jackson Tuchinski era is fully over, I'm worried. He hangs him up. Braden Stubbs hangs him up. Matt Stokeman, moving on to did he go to the league? I think he got drafted. Calgary. Right? A couple other big fellas on that line. And that was a stellar O-line. Like, again, it's, great running backs make a great O-line. Great O-lines make a great running backs. They make great running attacks writ large, right? Stubbs was doing his thing, but he had some big dogs up front being able to open up those gaps for him. Cole Ensu looks like a guy that might be the presumptive favorite to take over for this team. Exciting to see what that can come about, but it just has that feeling of, hey, at the end of the day, two teams aren't going to be in the playoffs for this conference, and you're hoping to rebuild and look towards the future, and we'll look at the defense as well. But just it's truly the end of an era with Stubbs and Tuchinski moving on, and it's just hard to bounce back from that. Maybe this is where we could have a little fun in talking about, like, we always talk about OUA trades. Maybe we could talk about like CanWest trades. Maybe we get Jake Farrell to head over to Manitoba, move one province eastward, but. As it stands, with those losses on offense and with those premier four teams we already talked about, it's a year where, hey, you got to take your lumps, look to rebuild, get some of those young guys ready to go, and look towards 2027. I hate to say that before we start the season, but just, I don't know.
Listen, we are pro Manitoba. We're certainly pro Coach Stan coming 100%. On the podcast with the exit meeting, talking about everything there. And Coach Stan, if you want to hook us up with some Manitoba Bisons football gear, we would love to have that. We'd
the big hats, much like the Montreal hats. I need two big hats, Tom. I need two hats. One's a Montreal big blue hat, and one's a Bison big blue hat.
You'd love to see it.
I'm a bald guy. I'm deserving of however many hats I want, okay?
But listen, this is, to be honest with you, like you mentioned, it is, no matter what, when you have an era, And it truly was a Tuchinski and Braden Stubbs era for this Manitoba Bison's offense. When they move on, this is not just a time where you can say, oh, no worries, we'll just reload. This is always going to be different. Now, that also gives you the opportunity to maybe change the way that your offense was running. If you want to add in some new wrinkles, if you want to do some things that maybe a Cole Ansu or a Jack McQuarrie really gives you from that quarterback spot, maybe this is the time and the opportunity for you to do this now. But like you mentioned, to lose Tuchinski, to lose Stubbs, to lose Matt Stokeman, who was a stalwart on that offensive line, Mark Rauhaus. There's a number of guys on that O-line that are moving on, and that only is going to make your life that much harder when you're going through and trying to reestablish yourself. Of course, if we don't talk about the bigs, nobody's going to talk about the bigs, so we understand how important Stokeman was to that offensive line. But to have significant losses at every position on the offense, O-line, D-line, receivers with Braden Smith and Vaughn Lloyd, that's not something you just bounce back from. So this is a Manitoba team that's going to have a hell of a time coming back up in a very talented CanWest conference. Now, if we trust anybody, we trust Coach Stan in order to get that done. But I say out of everybody there, and it's why we're talking about them now when we're talking about them, they've got the biggest hurdles to really try to get over if they want to be competitive within this space.
Worth noting, of course, Nathan Udo back. So for whoever wins that QB1 spot, they do have a premier target to be able to become a bit more accustomed to the U Sports, level as a QB1. Big year, no doubt, for our girl Maya Turner, though, if the offense is stalling out a little bit more. So that's exciting. I mean, defensively, they still bring back, leading tacklers in Nick Perea, in Dario Machia, and again, no doubt some other guys that just haven't gotten the know-how on this defense that will hopefully be able to keep them in some games. Again, like you mentioned it with Alberta last year too, where even though they're coming in that last spot, they're still competitive in these games. I have no doubt Coach Stan's going to get his guys right, going to be in those games, and there's probably going to be a game here and there where, much like we've talked about with AUS and RSCQ, these smaller conferences than our OUA, when you play multiple matchups, like coaching almost becomes that much more important,
certainly,
in a sense, right? Because when we talked about it with, I think it was Coach Waterman, about coaching in AUS and playing teams twice, thrice, sometimes 4 times, he's like, but you can't hide anything matchup to matchup, right? So it really comes down to that coaching. Love getting to listen from and learn from Coach Stan. If you didn't listen to that one, go check it out. Any other thoughts about the Bisons this year, Tom? Again, I don't mean to slow play or to do a quick and dirty on them, but it's the case when the teams that we think are slightly lower in the ranks than the other ones, they're just not going to get as much airtime. Love all still deserve, though.
Certainly. I think, once again, we talked about it. I think Manitoba is certainly going to have to find their guys to replace a number of unbelievable players that they had offensively here. If they can do that, if they can continue to get back in that defense that's mostly coming back and still be great, they got a chance. But those are a lot of really big ifs.
Should we go through the schedule, Tom?
Let's do it.
All right, beautiful. So let's start off September 4th, UBC. It is a Friday, September 4th, UBC at Calgary. I mean, come on. I mean, we'll dive into them in a second. But UBC at Calgary, Regina at Alberta on Saturday, September 5th, Saskatchewan heading to Manitoba. On Friday, September 11th, Calgary goes to Saskatchewan, Manitoba goes to Regina, and Alberta goes to UBC. Friday, September 18th, Saskatchewan visits the Golden Bears in Alberta. Regina goes to UBC. And on Saturday, September 19th, Calgary goes to Manitoba. Friday, September 25th, Alberta goes to Calgary. Saturday, September 26th, Saskatchewan goes to Regina, and UBC goes to Manitoba. Moving into October, Friday, October 2nd, Manitoba goes to face off against Alberta, and on Saturday, October the 3rd, Regina goes to Calgary. UBC goes to Saskatchewan. Thursday, October 15th, Alberta plays Regina. Friday, October 16th, Manitoba goes to Saskatchewan, and Calgary goes to UBC. Friday, October 23rd, UBC goes to Regina, and Alberta goes to Saskatchewan, followed by Manitoba at Calgary on Saturday, October 24th. And the season wraps up with Friday, October 30th, Saskatchewan at UBC, and on Saturday, October 31st, Regina at Manitoba, and Calgary at Alberta, a date which, again, as a reminder of, we'll be in Montreal watching Laval play Montreal, so we'll be checking on those games a little bit later. Tom, that's the schedule. What excites you? What games, aside from October 31st, are you going to be making sure to tune in for live and direct when you look at that schedule?
Honestly, I think one of the biggest matchups here is the sorry if I can find it here, the matchup between Calgary and UBC.
Well, I mean, first game of the season.
I think that's going to be really, really important, not just the September 4th, but they do meet again later on in the season. And I think when we're talking about the race that's going to be within the CanWest, that could mean the difference between having to travel or having to host something at home. Now, obviously, if we're saying that Saskatchewan and Regina are right up there between our favorites, that also comes into play. But I think the battle between Calgary and UBC is really going to be important going into this one. And I think even, again, not to favor UBC, but UBC traveling to Saskatchewan to play against the Huskies in this season as well, that's going to be a massive one. If UBC can find a way to win in Saskatoon, I think that's only going to help their playoff hopes going forward into this one. But those are the two off the hop that I'm really interested in.
I mean, obviously, the Battle of Saskatchewan,
Certainly.
which, I mean, from the looks of it, do we only get one Battle of Saskatchewan this year with... Oh, my goodness. Well, then, Saturday, September 26th, clear your schedules, folks. Sask at Regina. Tune into that one, 2 p.m. local time. I'm also, though, really excited for the matchups of when, from looking at it here, where is it? When we have Regina versus UBC on the 18th. Again, thinking about the matchup of Sombach, Wong, and those defensive guys against Drew Viotto. And then similarly... I don't know where it is off the top of my head, but I'll find it quickly here. Regina going to Calgary on Saturday, October 3rd. Similarly, like what is, I think, undoubtedly the best secondary in CanWest. And, you know, we'll talk about Queens as a part of the OUA pod next week with so many of their defensive backs moving on. Regina might have the crown of the best secondary in all of in all of U Sports. We're talking so highly of these young quarterbacks in Viotto and Jordan. Well, I mean, they got to play Regina last year, but it just makes it that much more exciting for them to go against these teams as well. But as always, CanWest football is such a pleasure, and frankly, no one covers their football better than CanWest. So a salute to CanWest TV. The broadcasts are stellar, and can't wait to be tuning in for those games. Tom, I think that's a pretty good job by us. I hope so. To our fans out west, let us know what you think. Leave a comment. Leave a couple 5 stars if you could. 4 is okay, but 5's even better. And as always, how you envision us continuing to cover this conference as a part of our U Sports coverage. As obviously the season's creeping up, we've pretty well solidified what our plan is, but we're always amenable to more ideas, especially if it's what y'all want to see, want to hear. And as always, wherever you're tuning in, whenever you're tuning in, and however you're tuning in, we are immensely grateful. Tom, last thoughts on CanWest before the season kicks off in a couple weeks?
A conference and teams that are shooting up to some of my very favorite football to watch across the country is this CanWest team. These CanWest teams. They are truly incredible. What the atmosphere is like out west is truly amazing. I had the chance to go out to Alberta a couple of times. I saw the Golden Bears. I saw the Dinos in training camp. I got a chance to call the game for Regina versus UBC out in BC. And what an incredible atmosphere that is. And listen, CanWest officials, if you want to fly out your boys to go and watch and cover a game, we would love to be able to do that. This is such an incredible conference. I'm so excited to be covering it more and deep diving it more with you to truly bring some of our best coverage for this squad and these teams. But man, I cannot wait for the CanWest to get going.
As a few programming reminders, this episode will be coming out on August 19th. We're recording on the 14th, so of course, any news and notes that happened in training camp, they're within. I don't think we're going to do an emergency edit to the episode. You know, we love doing this, but once the pod's done, the pod is done. As we mentioned on the RCQ pod, but no harm in repeating it, August 26th is when you will get OUA season preview, conference preview that is, and then on August 27th is when you get the week 1 preview. So stay tuned for all of that, and you know the place to be next week to catch up on what's going on in the OUA is right here at the 55.